We're unlocking a threshold tonight that the Vatican hoped would remain forever closed. A mystery threaded through the most ancient scripture, murmured within outlawed writings, and concealed beneath a deliberate hush spanning multiple centuries. This is the tale of entities existing somewhere between mortal and celestial, colossal beings emerging from where heaven met earth, the Nephilim. Their very existence wasn't merely disputed, it was wiped from memory, secured in chambers deeper than underground tombs, watched over by record keepers sworn to eternal silence, and masked by carefully constructed teachings designed to prevent you from posing the single question capable of dismantling our entire understanding. Suppose they actually existed. Suppose they built kingdoms. Suppose their lineage continues flowing silently through our modern world. The further down this path you venture, the more peculiar reality becomes. Enormous skeletal remains that somehow avoided museum exhibitions. Holy figures portrayed with strength beyond human limits. Sacred buildings constructed featuring doorways impossibly tall for average people. And age-old manuscripts condemned as forbidden texts simply because they disclosed too much information. Yet tonight, we're pursuing the pathway the Church hoped nobody would ever discover. So before we delve deeper into this enigma, before we unseal these chambers and face whatever remained after the Great Deluge, pause for a moment to like this video and subscribe. You're going to discover the prohibited knowledge the Vatican dreads regarding the Nephilim. Within every tale from antiquity, there exists an instant when reality feels altered, when recorded history shivers, when something beyond possibility enters the domain of actual events. Picture an era stretching back before civilizations emerged and crumbled, stretching back before our planet became separated by territorial lines or spiritual systems, when our world was in its youth, and the heavens appeared nearer than they seem in our time. This marks where the Nephilim narrative originates, in a reality where towering beings traveled alongside mankind and the boundary separating paradise from earth was delicate enough that footsteps could traverse it. The peculiar element is this narrative isn't concealed within some obscure vanished text. It rests directly within the initial chapters of sacred scripture, in Genesis chapter 6, a section most individuals overlook, despite containing one of the most disturbing secrets throughout all theological chronicles. It portrays an instance when divine sons gazed upon human daughters and claimed them for marriage. And through this forbidden coupling emerged entities unlike anything creation had previously witnessed. The Nephilim, enormous beings, powerful hybrids, blending celestial and earthly origins, creatures possessing too much power to dismiss, yet carrying too much danger to commemorate openly. That single brief passage has disturbed religious scholars across thousands of years precisely because it doesn't align with the straightforward reality we're conditioned to envision. It suggests an age when supernatural entities roamed openly among humankind. And that singular concept poses a threat to reshape everything we accept about our ancient past. Should this account be factual, then early mankind wasn't isolated. It coexisted on Earth alongside beings possessing far superior strength and intelligence compared to regular people. Yet there's something considerably more peculiar. The religious establishments that constructed their foundations upon sacred texts seldom mention this particular passage. They scan past it hastily. They flip the page. They continue onward. For what reason? What makes this narrative create such discomfort? Why does one sentence describing enormous beings feel threatening to the pillars of belief? The more thoroughly you investigate, the more strongly you detect something troubling. Across the ancient globe, narratives exist of mighty entities descending from above and instructing primitive humans in secrets never intended for their understanding. Old Sumerian clay tablets reference deities arriving to interact with mortal beings. Hellenic myths describe celestial beings producing offspring with humans. Even societies separated across vast oceans retain memories of a vanished age when colossal beings carved mountains and waged legendary conflicts. Yet Scripture provides the most ancient recorded testimony of all. It doesn't reject these entities. It identifies them, the Nephilim, and then proceeds forward as though hoping nobody will pose the natural question: what was their true identity? The puzzle deepens further when you examine what transpired afterward. Based on the narrative, the appearance of these mixed beings brought violence and disorder throughout the planet, and shortly following, the catastrophic flood erased nearly every living thing. Numerous people have pondered whether the deluge wasn't merely retribution for wrongdoing, but a purification of a genetic contamination extending beyond our capacity to comprehend. A restart of mankind, a restart of chronicles. Still today, learned individuals debate the true meaning behind the term Nephilim. Certain scholars claim it signifies fallen beings. Alternative interpretations say it indicates giants, yet all parties concur on a single point. It references something from antiquity possessing great power that nobody completely grasps. And should this account transcend mythology, then the reality we believe we understand may merely represent a faint reflection of the world that previously existed. The real question isn't about whether enormous beings walked our planet. The actual question concerns whether evidence about them has remained concealed in obvious view throughout time. There exists one verse within sacred scripture that seems misplaced. It emerges early within the text, positioned discreetly inside Genesis chapter 6, immediately preceding Noah's story and the catastrophic deluge. You might overlook it during a casual reading, yet if you examine it carefully, it transforms your entire understanding. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 declares, "Giants existed on the earth during those ancient days, and also afterward, when divine sons came to human daughters, and they bore children to them. These same offspring became powerful individuals of ancient times, individuals of great fame." Just like that, Scripture informs us that enormous beings previously traversed the earth. Yet the narrative concludes right there. No identifying information, no geographical details, no additional context. Simply one peculiar sentence, followed by stillness. And throughout churches spanning the globe, that particular verse receives almost no verbal acknowledgement. Ministers advance beyond it. Scripture study materials glance across it. Most individuals mature, never hearing about it whatsoever. Yet why? What reason exists for a verse appearing so early within holy texts to receive treatment resembling an error? The explanation may prove more unsettling than the verse itself. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 doesn't simply reference giants. It implies they originated from a coupling between celestial entities and female humans, divine sons and mortal daughters. The phrasing is archaic, yet the significance remains transparent. Something from beyond our realm descended and permanently altered humanity. And should that be accurate, then we're not the sole intelligent entities who've influenced recorded history. This concept has created profound unease among religious establishments across centuries, precisely because if angelic or divine entities possess the capacity to procreate with humans, it undermines everything we're instructed regarding the established order of creation. It obscures the division between paradise and earth, between the sacred and the prohibited, and the Church, despite all its authority, has perpetually required distinct boundaries: righteousness and wickedness, paradise and damnation, angels and demons. Yet the Nephilim represent something different, something occupying the middle ground, something Scripture identifies but never clarifies. That's the reason this verse carries danger. It creates an opening toward questions no authority figures desire you to raise. What was the identity of these divine sons? What motivated their arrival here? And should their descendants be giants, how numerous were they among us once? Certain early religious leaders did address this verse. Theologians, including Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, accepted that these divine sons were genuinely angels, and their rebellion introduced corruption to our world. Yet as the church expanded more influential and increasingly structured, these narratives were discreetly set aside. The Book of Enoch, providing the complete account in striking detail, was excluded from Scripture within most traditions. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 persisted, yet stripped of context, resembling a warning emptied of its significance. And thus it remains within Scripture, resembling a mystery nobody receives permission to investigate. A puzzle concealed within plain sight, and each occasion a minister bypasses it, each occasion a Scripture study overlooks it, that hush becomes more pronounced. Because silence represents more than simply speech's absence, it sometimes constitutes the most transparent indication of dread. Should the church have dedicated centuries evading one sentence, perhaps that sentence contains truth more substantial than anyone ventures to acknowledge, not resulting from falsehood, but stemming from the possibility it might be factual. There exists a manuscript predating most Holy Scripture, a manuscript once holding an honored position among initial Christian compositions, yet presently you won't locate it within most religious institutions. It's identified as the Book of Enoch, and across centuries it remained concealed, abandoned, or completely prohibited, not stemming from inaccuracy, but resulting from revealing excessive truth. Whereas Genesis provides merely one cryptic sentence regarding the Nephilim, the Book of Enoch delivers the comprehensive narrative. It identifies the angels. It clarifies the uprising. It portrays how they arrived on earth and transformed everything. These angels received the designation the Watchers, 200 total. They were intended to observe, to provide guidance, yet instead they violated the celestial regulations. They gazed upon female humans and decided to claim them for marriage. The children they produced weren't typical. They were enormous beings, entities possessing immense stature and unusual power, the Nephilim. Yet the Book of Enoch doesn't conclude there. It discloses something considerably more hazardous. It states the Watchers additionally provided prohibited understanding to humans, mysteries of celestial bodies, lunar movement, weapon construction, herbal applications, magical forces. They granted humans instruments intended exclusively for the heavens. And accompanying that understanding arrived disorder, warfare, slaughter, moral decay. The planet suffered beneath the burden of these enormous beings. Mankind, once pure, became saturated with brutality. And thus the Book of Enoch declares the deluge was dispatched not merely to purify wrongdoing but to eliminate the Nephilim lineage. A complete restart on a reality spiraling beyond governance. This wasn't simply a narrative. It represented a caution. And that's precisely why the church couldn't permit its circulation. For initial Christians, the Book of Enoch received widespread reading. The Apostle Jude actually references it explicitly within the New Testament. It formed part of the spiritual dialogue across centuries. Yet, as the church commenced organizing its authority, it required a simpler narrative. One deity, one adversary, one account of events. And the Book of Enoch complicated everything. It portrayed angels appearing imperfect. It portrayed heaven appearing fractured. It portrayed ancient chronicles resembling something considerably more sophisticated and hazardous than official teachings permitted. Therefore, they excluded it. They labeled it non-canonical. They prohibited its public recitation. They secured it away. Across nearly 1,000 years, the Book of Enoch disappeared from Western regions. It remained preserved exclusively in Ethiopia, where it continued as sacred text. When European scholars rediscovered it during the 19th century, they experienced astonishment. This manuscript had forecasted the arrival of a chosen individual. It portrayed a celestial assembly. It contained prophecies aligning with portions of Revelation, and yet nobody had knowledge of it because it had been eliminated, not through flames, but through silence. The question isn't why the Book of Enoch faced exclusion. The question concerns what the church feared it would stimulate. Should humans have once traveled beside enormous beings? Should angels have once instructed forbidden wisdom? Then our historical record isn't merely fragmented. It has undergone burial, and the Book of Enoch may constitute the sole remaining voice speaking from underneath the soil. Prior to the deluge, prior to the emergence of rulers and kingdoms, there occurred another variety of descent, not involving humans, but involving angels, the Watchers. That represented their designation, 200 celestial entities dispatched to monitor the earth. They weren't demonic forces. They weren't expelled downward. They arrived by choice. Their assignment was straightforward. Observe, guide, never meddle. Yet something transformed. As they observed the world, they witnessed the magnificence of human existence, creation's wonder, and something occurred that even paradise couldn't anticipate. They developed curiosity, subsequently they developed temptation, and ultimately they executed a decision that would disturb the universe. According to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers descended to earth at a location designated Mount Hermon. There they established an agreement. Each one pledged an oath that should one among them violate the divine restriction, they would all remain united. Connected by their personal declaration, they crossed the threshold. They claimed human wives. They produced children. These children weren't typical. They were enormous beings, the Nephilim. Yet the Watchers accomplished more than simply violating heavenly regulation. They granted humans mysteries, prohibited understanding, concepts never intended for mortal knowledge. One instructed the harvesting of roots and herbal usage. Another disclosed the star pathways and lunar mysteries. One demonstrated how to create weapons from iron and fashion metal into warfare instruments. Another instructed the practice of mysticism and utilizing talismans and incantations. These weren't simply presents, they were weapons, instruments of change, understanding capable of elevating a civilization or annihilating a planet. And that's precisely what transpired. As the Nephilim matured, they consumed everything. They depleted the earth's nourishment. They hunted creatures to elimination. Subsequently, they directed themselves toward mankind. The world descended into brutality, and creation's equilibrium shattered. Yet what was the Watchers' true identity? Certain individuals claim they were angels designated to earth for its protection. Alternative beliefs suggest they formed part of a greater design never intended for disclosure. Yet one element remains transparent. Their descent differed from Lucifer's. It wasn't generated from arrogance or insurrection. It originated from attraction, inquisitiveness, affection even. And that may constitute what renders them considerably more hazardous. Precisely because they didn't arrive to annihilate. They arrived to distribute. And what they distributed transformed everything. The Book of Enoch identifies them. Semjaza, their commander. Azazel, the individual who instructed warfare. Armoros, who instructed incantations. These identifications are ancient reverberations, abandoned by time, eliminated from sermons, and yet they persist resembling fractures in our historical foundation. The Watchers received punishment. Based on the narrative, God dispatched the archangel Raphael to restrain them underneath the earth until Judgment Day. Their descendants, the Nephilim, were eliminated in the flood. Yet, certain individuals believe their impact never completely vanished. That, the understanding they provided, continues lingering within emblems, within ceremonies, within secret manuscripts concealed in stone chambers. Should the Watchers have arrived once, what prevents their return? And should they return, will anyone recall the caution they departed behind? Or will the world again misinterpret their presence as divine interventions and compensate the cost for understanding we were never intended to possess? Throughout every ancient society, there occur sudden expansions of understanding appearing from nowhere. The capacity to chart stars with absolute precision, the ability to construct monuments synchronized with celestial objects, sophisticated metal instruments, peculiar symbols etched in stone appearing to communicate a language predating any civilization. Where did all this originate? How did primitive humans possessing no educational institutions, no machinery, no written communication, obtain access to such sophisticated comprehension of reality? The response, based on one of history's most ancient prohibited texts, is they received instruction from entities not originating from this world, the Watchers. The Book of Enoch portrays an instant when these 200 angels arrived from the heavens and provided forbidden presents to mankind, not merely spiritual lessons, but genuine capabilities. They instructed individuals how to map the stars, how to comprehend lunar phases, how to interpret planetary movements. This understanding wasn't intended for mankind, yet the Watchers provided it without reservation. And it didn't conclude there. One among them, identified as Azazel, instructed humans how to extract metal from the ground. He demonstrated how to manufacture swords, blades, protective shields, and armor plating. He disclosed the mysteries of combat. Another instructed the practice of mysticism. Others disclosed how to utilize roots and vegetation to modify the consciousness and physical form. One instructed how to manufacture mirrors, how to create cosmetics from minerals and powder, not because appearance mattered, but because it could facilitate manipulation, distraction, temptation. It constituted all understanding, yet it arrived too rapidly, and it arrived lacking wisdom. Numerous ancient societies reference an era when the deities traveled among them and transferred sacred instruments. In Egypt, the deity Thoth supposedly brought written language and astronomical knowledge. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu were entities dispatched by the deities to provide civilization. In India, the Vedas reference powerful entities who traveled in flying vessels and controlled lethal weapons. Suppose these were all varied recollections of the identical occurrence, the identical visitors, the identical watchers. Contemporary historians categorize it mythology. Yet certain researchers accept these narratives indicate a genuine historical instance, an era when someone or something expedited the advancement of human understanding, yet it arrived with consequences. The Book of Enoch declares, "The earth protested beneath the burden of what transpired. The Nephilim became brutal. Humanity directed itself against itself. Creation's equilibrium fractured. And therefore the deluge arrived, not to eliminate wrongdoing, but to eliminate what had been released. The Watchers were restrained. Their descendants were eradicated, yet the understanding they provided didn't disappear. It remained, concealed within ancient manuscripts, transferred through emblems, maintained in secrecy. Certain individuals claim it became the basis of secretive organizations. Alternative beliefs suggest it continues dormant within abandoned ruins, anticipating rediscovery. The Vatican understands this narrative. The Book of Enoch previously formed part of their collections. They selected to exclude it, not stemming from inaccuracy, but because it indicated a reality too intricate, too peculiar, too hazardous. A reality where angels granted mankind the authority of deities, and where that authority nearly annihilated us entirely. The deluge was intended to represent the conclusion, a celestial restart, a cleansing of all moral decay. The Nephilim, those peculiar enormous beings originating from angels and humans, supposedly faced complete elimination, their settlements submerged, their skeletal remains interred underneath layers of sediment and stillness. Yet something regarding that narrative feels incomplete, precisely because following the deluge, enormous beings emerge again. Within the chapters of ancient manuscripts, within the recollections of societies, within the lineages of rulers, Scripture itself suggests this puzzle. Within the Book of Numbers, centuries following the deluge, reconnaissance agents are dispatched into Canaan territory. What they communicate is disturbing. They claim they witnessed enormous beings, descendants of the Nephilim. They portray themselves as insects, in comparison, frightened, surpassed. Therefore, how could they continue existing if the deluge had eliminated them? Certain scholars propose that not all the lineage faced destruction. Perhaps one among the wives aboard Noah's vessel carried the Nephilim ancestry. Perhaps the deluge didn't blanket the complete earth as we conceptualize it presently. Perhaps certain hybrid lineages concealed themselves in elevated mountains or subterranean settlements. Whatever the situation, the ancient world following the deluge remains troubled by remnants of enormous beings, and not merely within mythology. Examine closely the royal lineages throughout history. In Egypt, the most ancient pharaohs supposedly were partially divine, descended from deities arriving from the stars. They were frequently depicted with enormous physiques, extended craniums, and supernatural understanding. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian monarch record documents rulers existing for hundreds of years. One monarch supposedly governed for exceeding 20,000 years, and within scripture, Goliath wasn't the sole enormous being. Others exist. Og, Bashan's monarch, governed over territory occupied by enormous beings. His sleeping platform was portrayed as immense, constructed from iron, measuring nearly 13 feet in length. Suppose these rulers weren't simply tall individuals with mythology surrounding them. Suppose they were descendants of something more ancient, something surviving the deluge, not merely physically, but genetically. Across time, the concept of divine authority became prevalent among monarchs, the acceptance that their governance originated from the heavens. Yet suppose that wasn't merely metaphorical. Suppose certain rulers understood they were different, that they possessed within them a fragment of something ancient, something powerful, that their lineage wasn't entirely human. Even throughout medieval Europe, aristocratic families maintained obsession with ancestry. Royal unions were orchestrated not for affection, but for genetic purity. Documenting lineage transcended tradition. It represented control, a method to safeguard whatever secret authority that lineage possessed. Certain individuals claim that's why particular families appeared immune, beyond legal authority, beyond the church, precisely because they were descendants of an abandoned race. The hybrids once governing through stature, and might presently governed through prosperity and impact. The Vatican, possessing its enormous collections and ancient manuscripts, probably understands more than it discloses. Should the Nephilim lineage have influenced kingdoms, then history itself has received guidance from something not completely human. And perhaps the most significant secret isn't that enormous beings once traversed the earth, but that their descendants never ceased traveling. They merely discovered how to remain hidden. There exists a location underneath the pathways of Vatican City where daylight has never penetrated. A location predating the Renaissance and more protected than any wealth chamber on earth. It's recognized as the Vatican's secret archive. Yet despite the designation, it isn't fictional. It's absolutely genuine. And based on murmurs from scholars, former clergy, and a limited number who've traversed its frigid stone passages, it may contain the most significant secrets of human chronicles. Among them, the reality regarding enormous beings. The authorized narrative states the collection contains papal correspondence, church documentation, and ancient theological manuscripts. Yet those who've witnessed more claim there exist chambers secured behind iron barriers. Chambers containing objects never intended for discovery. Enormous skeletal remains that don't correspond with the human framework. Cartographic representations displaying continents preceding their discovery. Scrolls composed in languages nobody has articulated across over 1,000 years. And most enigmatic of all, comprehensive testimonies of the Nephilim. Certain among these documentations supposedly originate from early missionaries traveling to remote territories and returning with narratives of immense skeletal remains located in burial sites. Alternative records portray cathedrals being erected on locations where enormous bones were excavated only to be extracted during nighttime by concealed figures. There even exist rumors of correspondence between popes and monarchs addressing how to handle such discoveries without generating public alarm. These communications were never released, yet they're supposedly maintained in the chambers, meticulously organized, never observed. Throughout the early 20th century, there existed documentation of enormous skeletal remains located in Italy, Turkey, and regions of North Africa. Certain measured exceeding 9 feet tall. Regional publications covered the narratives for perhaps 2 days. Subsequently, they disappeared. The bones were discreetly transported away, not to exhibition halls, but to the Vatican. This sequence repeats continuously. A discovery occurs. A limited number of photographs circulate, followed by stillness. The location is restricted, the artifacts vanish, and the narrative dissipates, resembling vapor. What motivation would the Vatican possess for concealment? The explanation might reside in what enormous beings symbolize. The Nephilim aren't merely physical irregularities. They constitute a direct connection to a prohibited era, an era when angels traversed the earth, when understanding originated from above, when mankind wasn't isolated. Should that narrative be accurate, then the complete foundation of theological chronicles would require rewriting, and the Vatican, exceeding any alternative establishment, possesses the greatest stake. The Book of Enoch, the references within Genesis, the dispersed mentions of enormous beings in ancient manuscripts from across the globe, all of it establishes a sequence indicating something the Church previously understood but selected to inter, not eliminate, maintain but never distribute. That constitutes the most disturbing element. These documentation may continue existing, flawlessly maintained, secured away directly underneath the feet of pilgrims and visitors traversing the Vatican corridors daily. They'll never witness them because truth, when it endangers authority, isn't rejected. It's concealed, discreetly, thoroughly, and provided nobody poses the appropriate questions, it remains interred in darkness. Everyone recognizes Noah's vessel narrative. A virtuous individual cautioned by God to construct a great craft. A deluge dispatched to cleanse a world immersed in wrongdoing. Creatures advanced 2 by 2. Precipitation descended for 40 days and nights. And when the waters ultimately withdrew, a fresh beginning surfaced. It's a narrative recounted to youngsters, illustrated on church surfaces, and recalled as instruction in compliance and belief. Yet suppose the narrative we received was merely partial truth? Suppose the deluge wasn't simply regarding punishing wrongdoing? Suppose it was something considerably more targeted, a restart not of ethics, but of genetics. Within Genesis chapter 6, immediately preceding the deluge's commencement, there exists a peculiar transition in the narrative. It declares, divine sons descended and produced children with mortal daughters. Their descendants were the Nephilim, enormous beings, entities of tremendous strength and enigma. And subsequently, abruptly, God observes that the earth is saturated with brutality and moral decay. He determines to annihilate all existence. Yet the chronology is significant. The deluge doesn't arrive preceding the Nephilim. It arrives resulting from them. The Book of Enoch clarifies this in considerably more specificity. It declares, the Watchers, descended angels, provided prohibited understanding to humans. Their descendants, the Nephilim, became monstrous. They consumed everything. They directed themselves toward mankind. They contaminated the earth, not merely with brutality, but with a compromised lineage. Humanity was no longer completely human. Something different had blended with it, something unnatural. Therefore, the deluge becomes something altered, not merely a punishment, a purification, a deliberate elimination of a genetic experimentation gone catastrophically wrong, a method to cleanse the record and restart the human narrative. Within that perspective, Noah's vessel assumes fresh significance. Based on Scripture, Noah was selected not exclusively because he was virtuous, but because he was flawless in his generations. That expression, frequently overlooked, could signify something additional. It could signify his lineage was uncorrupted, unaffected by the Nephilim contamination. Should this be accurate, the vessel wasn't simply regarding preserving species. It concerned maintaining a pure genetic foundation. This concept isn't restricted to Scripture. Societies across the globe communicate narratives of a catastrophic deluge dispatched by the deities. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh portrays an enormous deluge, destroying a reality of disorder. Within Hindu manuscripts, Manu receives caution of a deluge and receives instruction to construct a craft. In ancient Mesoamerican regions, the deities dispatch water to conclude an age of enormous beings. Varying identifications, varying territories, identical narrative, a reality compromised, a deluge that restarts it. Yet should the Nephilim be the motivation, why did nobody reference it transparently? Why was the narrative sanitized into a tale of straightforward wrongdoing? Perhaps because the concept of hybrid entities challenges excessively. It examines the essence of mankind. It discloses a past considerably more peculiar than most are prepared to accept. And it suggests that those ancient times weren't saturated with mythology, but recollection. The Vatican understands these narratives. The Book of Enoch faced exclusion from public observation for a purpose, precisely because it connects the deluge to something the Church cannot clarify. Not merely a God of compassion, but a God who executed a determination to eliminate part of his personal creation, not to discipline, but to cleanse. And within that action resides a reality most remain unprepared to confront. That we're not the initial version of mankind, merely the most recent version permitted to persist. Within the silent sections of chronicles, interred underneath layers of time and particles, there exist narratives that never reached educational materials. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, peculiar discoveries commenced surfacing throughout Europe and the Americas. Agricultural workers, adventurers, and archaeologists excavated skeletal remains, not merely ancient bones, enormous ones, skeletons considerably larger than any recognized human. Craniums with peculiar formations, jaw structures that could accommodate over a typical individual's face, femurs the dimension of boundary posts, and exactly as rapidly as they surfaced, they disappeared. Publications during that period didn't overlook these discoveries. Headlines from small communities documented the astonishing findings. In Pennsylvania, a skeleton measuring nearly 8 feet tall was located in a burial structure. In Wisconsin, excavators revealed multiple enormous beings interred collectively. In Nevada, mining workers encountered what they asserted were preserved remains of red-haired enormous beings concealed within a cavern. The documentation was comprehensive. Identifications were provided, measurements documented, observers signed declarations. Subsequently arrived the stillness. Nearly every one among these narratives concludes identically. An unidentified establishment intervenes. The skeletal remains are gathered, occasionally by governmental representatives, occasionally by individuals asserting affiliation with an exhibition hall or educational institution. Yet the remains never receive exhibition. No photographs distributed, no continuation documentation, exclusively silent rejections and the gradual dissolution of recollection. The regional residents are abandoned with exclusively the narratives and the increasing perception that something was extracted from them. Certain researchers accept these skeletal remains were extracted to safeguard a meticulously protected chronology. Because should enormous human-like entities have once traversed the earth, then substantial portions of what we're instructed regarding chronicles would disintegrate. Evolution, anthropology, theology, all of it would require rewriting. And the establishments controlling understanding don't appreciate rewriting. Murmurs have indicated the Smithsonian establishment particularly. There exist assertions, rejected naturally, that the Smithsonian previously possessed hundreds of enormous skeletal remains within its restricted collections. Skeletal remains never displayed to the population. Certain individuals even claim they faced destruction, not resulting from inherent danger, but resulting from what they demonstrated. Yet the Vatican's designation surfaces equally frequently within these narratives, particularly throughout Europe. When ancient burial locations were revealed, near aged churches or underneath cathedrals, peculiar remains were occasionally located. Oversized craniums, skeletal remains with unusual dimensions, and exactly resembling the Americas, these discoveries were rapidly gathered and secured away. No public exhibition, no scientific documentation, merely another absent fragment of an abandoned puzzle. What proves most unsettling isn't that these skeletal remains were located. It's that they never received examination, never received distribution, never received placement within mankind's narrative. Because had they received acknowledgement, individuals would have commenced posing questions. What was the identity of these entities? Where did they originate? And why do numerous ancient manuscripts reference enormous beings as though they were genuine? Perhaps the skeletal remains communicated truth? Perhaps the silence represented the response. When something doesn't align with the authorized narrative, it doesn't receive debate. It receives elimination. And occasionally the most significant evidence of all isn't within what you're displayed, but within what you're never permitted to witness. The Tower of Babel frequently receives instruction as a straightforward tale. Individuals became arrogant. They attempted constructing a tower reaching paradise. God dispersed their languages, preventing continued collaboration. A narrative regarding human arrogance and celestial punishment. Yet, if you examine more thoroughly, something more substantial conceals within the fractures. Something considerably more ancient, something connected to the prohibited legacy of the Nephilim. Following the deluge, the reality was intended to be fresh, purified. The enormous beings were eliminated. The watchers were interred. Yet ancient arrogance doesn't expire easily. It conceals within lineages, within recollection, within the murmured ambitions of those still recalling the authority once governing the earth, and within the reflection of that abandoned past, the Tower of Babel emerged. The Genesis book declares, "The complete earth possessed one language. The individuals assembled within Shinar territory and declared, 'Let us construct ourselves a settlement and a tower reaching toward paradise.'" Yet why? What motivation for reaching paradise? Why not construct residences, agricultural areas, sacred buildings? Why a tower toward the heavens? Unless they were attempting to return to something they'd previously experienced, unless they were attempting to forcefully unseal a passage that had received closure, certain individuals accept that those directing Babel's construction weren't merely regular individuals, that they possessed the Nephilim lineage, deluge survivors, descendants of hybrid ancestry, instructed by the Watchers, motivated by recollections of the reality preceding the restart. And the tower wasn't simply regarding elevation. It concerned access, reclaiming what had been forfeited. Ancient traditions declare the tower was a ziggurat, a variety of stepped pyramid utilized throughout Mesopotamia, synchronized to the stars, constructed with understanding considerably exceeding what was anticipated for that period, resembling Egypt's pyramids and the Maya temples. It possessed the characteristics of something peculiar, something ancient, prohibited understanding concealed as architecture. God's response was immediate and forceful, not merely punishment, a termination. He didn't simply halt the tower. He scrambled human communication. He fractured unity. He concluded the undertaking with force. That intensity of intervention exclusively makes sense if something hazardous was developing. If Babel wasn't merely a construction location, but an attempt to circumvent celestial regulation, to connect earth and paradise through artificial methods. Certain individuals even accept the tower wasn't merely emblematic, that it represented a variety of technology, a gateway, a communication apparatus, a stairway returning to the Watcher's domain, a method to contest the restrictions established following the deluge. And that possibility couldn't receive permission. The Vatican understands the more substantial layers of this narrative. Within its collections exist manuscripts from early Christian mystics who accepted the Tower of Babel was erected with understanding, transferred from descended angels, understanding that should have faced elimination but persisted secretly. Through dispersing the languages, God accomplished more than confusing individuals. He established obstacles to decelerate humanity's reach, to prevent another descent. Because the Tower of Babel wasn't merely constructed from brick and binding material. It was erected on recollection, on lineage, on the legacy of enormous beings who previously accepted they could reach paradise through force, and nearly succeeded. Within the particle-covered sections of ancient manuscripts and abandoned church documentation, there exist saints who don't conform to the pattern. Saints not recalled for silent prayer or modest miracles, but for their stature, their might, and their appearance that appeared to disturb the ground underneath them. Certain were portrayed as towering above others. Their hands could demolish weapons. Their voices could silence assemblies, and their adversaries frequently escaped at witnessing them. These weren't merely devout individuals. They were something different, something more ancient, something edited. Throughout medieval Europe, narratives commenced circulating regarding saints appearing more resembling warriors or deities than straightforward Christ followers. Street Christopher, for instance, supposedly was so elevated that he previously transported a child across a waterway and nearly submerged because the child expanded heavier with each movement. Subsequently, mythology asserted the child was Christ himself, yet earlier narratives suggest something additional. Within certain versions, Street Christopher is portrayed possessing a canine face, a detail later extracted or revised. Alternative accounts claim he originated from an enormous being race. Subsequently, there exists Street Gildas, supposedly existing long exceeding a typical human duration. Street Olaf of Norway was recalled as an individual capable of controlling a weapon too massive for alternative individuals to raise. And the Irish accounts of Street Finbar portray an illumination surrounding him, causing others to collapse to their knees. These aren't characteristics of typical individuals. These are remnants of something more substantial. Within numerous among these narratives, there exists a peculiar sequence. Their parentage is ambiguous. Their early years are abbreviated. They emerge within the narrative already developed, powerful, enlightened. Certain even surface without transparent birth documentation whatsoever, as though they merely materialized. This marks where the questions commence. Were these saints descended from ancient lineages? Could they have possessed within them the final remnants of the Nephilim? Should the enormous being's lineage have survived the deluge, it wouldn't have persisted openly. It would have proceeded underground, concealed behind designations, behind religious garments, behind sanctity. A lineage safeguarded not through brutality, but through veneration. And the Church, previously burning heretics for considerably less, may have determined to conceal the reality behind sainthood, to transform lineages into mythology, to reshape authority as celestial approval. Certain among the most ancient cathedrals throughout Europe were erected over ancient structures, pagan sacred buildings, enormous being graves, sacred locations predating Christianity by thousands of years. The Church didn't annihilate these locations. It absorbed them, sanctified them, and perhaps through doing so, it additionally absorbed the lineages connected to them. Should certain saints be Nephilim descendants, their abilities would have been perceived as both endangerment and possibility. Rather than reveal them, the Church may have canonized them, providing the population someone for worship and providing the lineage a method to persist. The Vatican has never provided commentary on these narratives. The documentation of the early saints are substantially edited. Chapters are absent, testimonies revised, yet the mythology persists, and they indicate an era when sanctity and lineages were unified. An era when enormous beings wore religious garments, and the division between mortal and mythology was meticulously concealed behind coloured glass and stillness, long preceding the Church becoming the towering establishment it represents presently. Initial Christians interpreted from an extensive collection of manuscripts. Certain were recognizable, alternative ones were peculiar and saturated with narratives of angels, enormous beings, and celestial conflicts. One among the most honored manuscripts among them was the Book of Enoch. It received quotation by church leaders. It received reference within the Jude epistle, and it communicated the narrative of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the authentic motivation of the deluge. Yet somewhere between the initial days of belief and the emergence of structured theology, something transformed. The Book of Enoch faced prohibition, designated non-canonical, and discreetly interred. The question is why? What generated such dread among the early assemblies regarding these manuscripts? The response resides not within what the Book of Enoch presented inaccurately, but within what it disclosed too transparently. It portrayed a reality where angels arrived on earth, not as messengers, but as insurgents. They distributed prohibited understanding. They generated enormous beings. They modified mankind. This wasn't merely mythology. It represented a hazardous reflection to the early church's expanding authority. Within the 4th century, throughout the Laodicea assemblies and subsequently at Carthage, church authorities commenced establishing rigid boundaries surrounding what received consideration as sacred text. The objective was organization, unity, governance, and that signified any manuscript raising challenging questions required elimination. The Book of Enoch faced exclusion alongside alternative ones, not conforming to the authorized narrative, not resulting from falsehoods, but resulting from disclosing excessive truth. Enoch referenced angels receiving judgment, of ancient governors not being human, of a deluge intended to eliminate a hybrid race. These concepts disturbed the foundation of a purified and straightforward theology. The Church required a distinct separation between righteousness and wickedness, paradise and earth, celestial and descended. The Book of Enoch obscured those divisions. It demonstrated that even celestial entities could descend in methods not located within Lucifer's narrative. It disclosed that mankind's corruption originated not merely from wrongdoing, but from celestial interference. Through designating these realities as forbidden teachings, the Church assumed governance of the narrative. It instructed the faithful what to accept and what to abandon, and across centuries it succeeded. The prohibited manuscripts disappeared from Europe. Exclusively within Ethiopia did the Book of Enoch persist, concealed within the ancient Orthodox tradition. When Western scholars ultimately rediscovered it during the 19th century, they experienced astonishment. It completed the absent fragments of Genesis. It clarified the deluge. It disclosed the Watchers' identifications, and it demonstrated that initial Christians understood considerably more than we received instruction. Yet even presently, the Church doesn't reference it. It maintains stillness because acknowledging these manuscripts would unravel chronicles constructed on partial realities. It would necessitate a complete re-examination of what genuinely transpired preceding the deluge, the true identity of the Nephilim, and how extensively their lineages extended. The Church didn't prohibit Enoch stemming from falsehood. It prohibited it because it represented a key to a secured threshold they never desired reopened. And that threshold, once unsealed, might disclose a version of Chronicles the world was never intended to witness. Traverse through the magnificent cathedrals throughout Europe, and you'll sense it, a perception that you're diminutive, that the surfaces surrounding you extend excessively elevated, that the doorways aren't merely tall, but impossibly tall. You gaze upward at the arched structures and the overhead surfaces, and question why they were erected with such overpowering magnitude. Was it entirely just emblematic, a method to make individuals sense the authority of paradise? Or was there something different, something concealed within obvious view? Examine the entrances of Notre Dame in Paris, or the towering gateways of Cologne Cathedral in Germany. These aren't merely ornamental doorways. They're enormous. Certain ones are exceeding 30 feet tall, and they're not isolated. Throughout dozens of ancient religious buildings, you'll locate thrones excessively large for sitting, staircases with steps excessively elevated for typical stride, and elevated platforms accessible only by ascending steps more appropriate for someone double our stature. Architects clarify this by stating it was intended to reflect magnificence. Yet suppose these structures weren't merely emblematic. Suppose they were operational. Suppose they were erected for entities larger than ourselves. The most ancient cathedrals were frequently erected atop older locations, pagan sacred buildings, pre-Christian sanctuaries. Certain among these locations were selected not merely for spiritual motivations, but resulting from what had been located there. Skeletal remains, engravings, burial chambers, and in unusual situations, structures suggesting someone had previously constructed on a considerably larger magnitude. Rather than annihilate these remnants, the church erected over them, and perhaps through doing so, maintained the dimensions of whoever had preceded. Across the Middle Ages, narratives of enormous beings saturated European folklore. Yet certain among those narratives weren't merely communicated by peasants, they were etched into the stone of the precise structures the church designated sacred. Concealed within the columns and archways of cathedrals are engravings of tall robed figures towering above humans. Certain possess extended craniums. Certain carry peculiar staffs or spheres, and in particular situations, these figures are displayed, traversing through doorways, matching the oversized entrances we continue witnessing presently. Art historians categorize this symbolism, a method to portray the divine, yet the sequence is excessively consistent, excessively detailed. It emerges not merely in one region, but throughout the continent, in France, in Spain, in Italy, in the British Isles. Enormous dimensions woven into sacred architecture and perpetually in the most ancient sections of the church. There additionally exist legends that the constructors of these cathedrals possessed assistants, that stonemasons received instruction by enigmatic individuals arriving from remote territories and possessing scrolls of ancient understanding. The Templars represented one such assembly accused of maintaining secrets from the era preceding the deluge. Perhaps they understood the authentic purpose behind the magnitude of these structures. Perhaps they understood whom they were genuinely honoring. Should the Nephilim have survived genetically or spiritually, it becomes logical they would have departed behind sacred buildings constructed in their representation. Not merely burial chambers, but monuments concealed openly, anticipating recognition. The question no longer concerns whether these structures are oversized. The question concerns whom they were authentically erected for, and whether their initial inhabitants might eventually return to traverse through those towering doorways once more. Long preceding Columbus ever positioning foot on American territory, narratives of enormous beings resonated throughout the valleys, plains, and mountains of the new continent. Native communities from coastline to coastline referenced entities who weren't merely tall but frightening. Red-haired, enormous beings possessing pale complexion, tremendous strength, and an appetite for combat. These narratives weren't myths murmured to youngsters. They were cautions, recollections transferred down across generations. And peculiarly, they resemble nearly identical to the narratives communicated thousands of years previously in the Middle East regarding the Nephilim. The Paiute individuals of Nevada, communicate of a fierce race of red-haired cannibal enormous beings designated the Sete-Ka. Based on tribal leaders, the Sete-Ka were previously present when their forebears arrived. They were enormous, hostile, and resided in caverns. Following years of struggle, the communities united and compelled the enormous beings into a final confrontation, incinerating them alive inside a cavern. That cavern, presently recognized as Lovelock Cave, would subsequently be excavated by archaeologists during the early 20th century. There they located peculiar artifacts, oversized footwear, ancient instruments, and most controversial of all, enormous skeletal remains and red human hair. The narrative doesn't conclude there. Communities like the Choctaw, the Comanche, and the Mandan all referenced enormous beings who previously governed portions of America. Certain claimed they could surpass buffalo in speed. Alternative individuals asserted they extracted trees from the ground using their bare hands. Numerous among these enormous beings were claimed to be aggressive, nearly godlike in might, yet deficient in compassion or ethics. Their destruction was perpetually brutal, a conflict, a deluge, an uprising, the identical sequence witnessed in the Nephilim narrative. What renders these testimonies so peculiar is how extensively they circulated. From South America to Canada, the legends persist consistent, enormous entities possessing peculiar characteristics, frequently portrayed as red-haired or light-complexioned. This corresponds with certain Middle Eastern portrayals of the Nephilim, who supposedly were different in appearance from the regional populations. Certain ancient Jewish manuscripts portray them as luminous, radiant, or even possessing fiery hair. Could it be that these weren't isolated occurrences, but a worldwide appearance? Should the Nephilim genuinely have traversed the earth, then what motivation would they possess for remaining in one location? Following the deluge, should even one have survived, what would prevent them or their descendants from traveling? Ancient maritime navigation may have been considerably more sophisticated than we conceptualize. Cartographic representations like the Piri Reis display coastlines with remarkable precision, centuries preceding modern navigation. Megalithic structures in Peru and Bolivia resemble those throughout the Middle East. Were these locations previously visited by the identical entities? Certain individuals accept the Vatican possesses documentation of early Jesuit missionaries encountering peculiar structures and enormous skeletal remains throughout the Americas. These communications, resembling numerous others, were never released publicly. Instead, they were discreetly transmitted back to Rome, where they disappeared into the collections. Should the narratives from both regions of the globe correspond so flawlessly, then we must pose the question no historian desires to confront. Did enormous beings previously govern not merely the ancient world, but the new continent too? And should they have? How substantial portions of our worldwide past has been meticulously edited to conceal a section too enormous to overlook. When the Jesuit missionaries arrived throughout the Americas during the 16th and 17th centuries, they arrived with more than merely Bibles. They brought ink, parchment, measuring instruments, and a profound inquisitiveness regarding the peculiar territories they were entering. Whereas their authorized assignment was converting the native populations to Christianity, numerous among them functioned as chroniclers, linguists, and adventurers. They maintained comprehensive journals, gathered artifacts, and recorded every unusual discovery they located. And among those findings were skeletal remains. Not merely any skeletal remains, but enormous bones. From the jungles of South America to the plains of North America, the Jesuits commenced reporting peculiar encounters. Certain communities communicated to them of ancient entities who previously governed the territory. Alternative ones displayed to them burial structures containing skeletons considerably larger than any individual. The missionaries, trained to monitor and communicate, documented everything. They dispatched correspondence back to Rome, occasionally with illustrations, occasionally with fragments, and subsequently stillness. The communications were received. The skeletal remains were transported, yet once they reached the Vatican, they disappeared. This sequence became excessively familiar. A missionary documents an 11-foot skeleton located in a cavern. Another portrays a burial location saturated with craniums triple the dimension of a typical human skull. These testimonies, previously part of authorized Jesuit correspondence, commenced disappearing from public observation. Certain were edited, alternative ones were eliminated. The missionaries themselves were frequently relocated or silenced. What commenced as genuine inquisitiveness transformed into silent elimination. What motivation would the Jesuits possess for this? Certain individuals claim it wasn't their determination, that the evidence they gathered was judged excessively hazardous by superior authorities within the Church. The appearance of enormous beings, particularly ones corresponding with the Nephilim portrayal, would compel the Church to clarify a version of Chronicles considerably beyond the biblical account it desired to safeguard. And therefore, the selection was executed. The enormous beings required elimination, yet not thoroughly. Certain Jesuits concealed their discoveries in encoded manuscripts. Alternative ones transferred their understanding down to secretive assemblies within the Church. Murmurs of this concealed understanding survived. Suggestions emerge in unusual manuscripts, confidential correspondence, even in aged cartographic representations, marking locations presently vanished to time. There additionally exists evidence that certain among these skeletal remains were secured in subterranean chambers underneath monasteries throughout Europe, maintained distant from public observation, yet never eliminated. It's accepted that certain Jesuit scholars commenced questioning their function. They witnessed that what they were recording wasn't legend, but suppressed reality. Certain became fixated, dedicating their existences searching for additional evidence. Alternative ones separated entirely, refusing to participate in the silence. Yet their voices were limited, and the Church's authority was enormous. The Vatican has never acknowledged these assertions. The authorized position persists unchanged. There existed no enormous beings. The narratives are emblematic. The skeletal remains were incorrectly identified. Yet the pathway departed behind by the Jesuits communicates otherwise. Should you pursue the correspondence, the cartographic representations, and the rumors, a transparent picture surfaces. The enormous beings were genuine, they were located, and the Church guaranteed they were abandoned, not stemming from mythology, but because they constituted the one reality too enormous to be permitted into illumination. Across thousands of years, monarchs and popes have governed not merely through authority, but through lineage. Their positions of power weren't captured. They were passed down, transferred like sacred objects across generations with one objective in consciousness, to maintain the bloodline pure. Yet what did that genuinely signify? Was it regarding politics, family devotion, or something considerably more ancient, something concealed underneath the garments and crowns? A secret fixation with maintaining a lineage that may not have been completely human? The concept of divine authority wasn't merely a theological assertion. It represented a lineage assertion that governors were selected by God because their lineage rendered them different, exceptional, sacred. This acceptance emerged in Europe, in the Middle East, and even throughout portions of Asia. Pharaohs asserted descent from the deities. European monarchs documented their lineages back to biblical figures. Popes were designated through secretive ceremonies that across centuries required verification of aristocratic or even enigmatic ancestry. It wasn't regarding who possessed the greatest morality. It concerned who possessed the appropriate lineage. In ancient Sumer, monarchs supposedly received their governance from the Anunnaki, celestial deities descending to earth. These deities were accepted to have modified human entities, generating governors who were partially divine. In Egypt, the god monarchs were accepted to be born of the deities and mortal females, a sequence mirroring the Nephilim narrative, divine sons and mortal daughters. And within Scripture, following the deluge, Noah's descendants abruptly commenced displaying indications of exceptional authority, wisdom, and extended lifespan, as though something within the lineage had survived. Throughout medieval Europe, aristocratic families maintained obsession with ancestry. Unions were orchestrated not for affection, but to safeguard lineages. Related individuals married related individuals. Partnerships were established through mutual ancestry. Certain royal families even asserted descent from the enormous Gog and Magog, and alternative ones maintained secret genealogies connecting them to biblical figures, accepting that this ancient lineage granted them the authority to govern. Yet suppose the lineage they protected wasn't merely royal, suppose it was hybrid. Certain researchers accept that particular families possessed remnants of the Nephilim bloodline, not sufficient to be enormous beings, yet sufficient to distinguish themselves. Elevated intelligence, unusual appearance, charisma approaching supernatural, and these characteristics were maintained through meticulous breeding, concealed behind emblems of sanctity and governance. The Church too may have participated by selecting popes from aristocratic lineages and executing secret ceremonies during designation. They guaranteed the continuation of something ancient. There even exist murmurs that certain initiation ceremonies executed in concealed portions of the Vatican involved lineage examination, not for illness, but for ancestry, to verify something possessed discreetly across generations, a genetic characteristic of a forgotten race, one previously governing through stature and might, and subsequently through understanding and belief. This concept challenges everything we've received instruction regarding authority, that it's earned, elected, designated. Suppose it was never regarding those elements. Suppose the genuine governors of the planet were selected, resulting from what they possessed in their veins. A remnant of the Nephilim, a fragment of something not completely human. And suppose they continue traversing among us, wearing crowns, wearing religious garments, and continuing safeguarding the lineage never intended to survive the deluge. Within the flickering shadows of candle-illuminated chambers and behind secured wooden doorways, secret organizations have assembled across centuries. They communicate through emblems. They wear garments marked with stars and geometric instruments. They erect sacred buildings in silence and convene underneath the lunar light. Certain individuals claim their ceremonies are harmless. Alternative ones claim they are protectors of something considerably more ancient than we comprehend. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Templars. Suppose their authentic purpose was never merely philosophy or charitable work. Suppose they were protecting the final fragments of prohibited understanding. The legacy of the Nephilim. Examine the emblems engraved into Masonic chambers, the all-observing vision, the square and geometric instrument, the twin columns designated Boaz and Jachin. These aren't random, they're ancient. The columns reflect those claimed to have positioned at Solomon's temple entrance, a temple that, based on legend, was erected with assistance from entities not completely human. Certain narratives claim Solomon commanded spiritual forces. Alternative murmurs suggest he possessed access to technology presented by the Watchers. Understanding that the Freemasons presently safeguard through metaphor and ceremony, the Rosicrucians reference concealed wisdom transferred down across the ages. Understanding predating even ancient Egypt, they accept a flawless reality that was interred to maintain it secure. Their compositions reference illumination, celestial bodies, transformation. Yet, behind the poetic language exists a more substantial code, one documenting back to the Book of Enoch, to the descended angels, to the Nephilim who previously traversed the earth. These organizations don't merely examine chronicles. They maintain it. They transfer it down secretly because the world isn't prepared for what it discloses. Across history, those approaching excessively near to this reality were silenced, incinerated as heretics, expelled as madmen. Yet within the meeting places and sacred buildings of these secret assemblies, the narratives survived. not thoroughly, but through emblems. The enormous beings became allegory. The watchers became directing illuminations. The deluge became a metaphor for restart. And behind every ceremony, a communication was murmured. Recall. Certain individuals accept the arrangement of Washington, D.C. received influence by Masonic symbolism, that the Capitol and the monuments established geometric sequences intended to reflect ancient celestial cartographic representations. Alternative ones claim the cathedrals of Europe possess concealed communications encoded within their architecture. Evidence departed behind by constructors understanding the reality yet not venturing to reference it transparently. Constructors forming part of a brotherhood predating any kingdom. The Church perpetually feared these assemblies, not stemming from wickedness, but because they recalled. The Vatican condemned the Templars. It observed the Freemasonry emergence with suspicion. It attempted to absorb or eliminate anything suggesting an older reality. Yet secrets this substantial don't disappear. They proceed underground. They anticipate. And presently, within the information age, certain among those secrets are surfacing again, not through authorized channels, but through emblems, through murmurs, through sequences concealing within obvious view. The Nephilim aren't merely a section in a prohibited manuscript. They constitute the foundation of a concealed belief, one maintained alive by those understanding that enormous beings previously governed the earth and might yet return. Elevated within the Arizona mountains, positions a peculiar structure possessing a dome opening to the celestial bodies. It belongs not to an educational institution or a confidential scientific assembly, but to the Vatican. It's designated the Vatican Observatory, one among the most ancient astronomical research establishments globally. A location where clergy and scientists examine the heavens simultaneously. The question is why? What motivation does the Church possess for observing the celestial bodies? And what precisely are they seeking? Officially, the Vatican declares it examines astronomy to better comprehend creation, that science and belief aren't adversaries, but partners, that through monitoring the cosmos, they can approach nearer to God's consciousness. Yet certain individuals accept there exists another motivation, one possessing nothing related to planets or celestial bodies, one extending back to the days preceding the deluge, to the Watchers era. The Book of Enoch declares, "The Watchers descended from the heavens to Mount Hermon. They arrived from above. They instructed prohibited understanding. They modified mankind, and they received punishment, restrained underneath the earth. Their descendants, the Nephilim, were eliminated in the deluge." Yet the manuscript suggests something disturbing, that eventually the Watchers will return, that their imprisonment isn't eternal, that there exists a clock advancing within the heavens. Could the Vatican be monitoring that clock? Ancient societies accepted the celestial sphere was more than merely stars. It represented a cartographic representation, a calendar, a caution system. The Mayans, Egyptians, and Sumerians all observed toward the heavens to forecast divine occurrences. They accepted the return of deities or enormous beings would be indicated by particular signs within the celestial sphere. Eclipses, comets, planetary synchronizations. Are we witnessing the identical occurrence presently? Certain researchers indicate the Vatican's unusual interest in infrared astronomy. Their observatory on Mount Graham contains a powerful instrument recognized as Lucifer. It represents large binocular telescope near-infrared utility with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research. A peculiar designation selection for a church telescope, unless it signifies something different. Within Latin, Lucifer signifies light-bringer, the identical designation previously granted to the descended ones. Suppose the Vatican isn't merely examining illumination, but observing for a return, a re-entry, an indication that the entities expelled down long previously are approaching back. Revelation references celestial bodies descending to earth, of the abyss receiving unsealing, of enormous beings emerging again. It resembles mythology until you witness the church erecting observatories in remote mountains, staffing them with clergy trained in both scripture and scientific knowledge. Subsequently, it commences sensing-like preparation. Should the Nephilim have originated from the celestial bodies, their return wouldn't arrive through politics or combat. It would arrive through the celestial sphere, a gradual approach, a celestial synchronization, an indication exclusively those observing attentively would witness. And the Vatican has been observing longer than most. The reality may be excessively enormous to conceal perpetually. Eventually, something may emerge within the heavens. And when it occurs, the Church might already understand what it represents because they've witnessed it previously. Interred in ancient manuscripts, etched into abandoned stone, and reflected within the frigid glass of a telescope, directed at the celestial bodies. Anticipating, observing, preparing. Within the concluding chapters of Scripture, within the Revelation book, there exist cautions of an era when the earth will be disturbed, when peculiar entities emerge, when the celestial sphere separates open, and when ancient authorities return. For most individuals, these prophecies are perceived as emblematic metaphors for combat, starvation, or moral deterioration. Yet one phrase distinguishes itself, resembling a key concealed within obvious view, as it existed during Noah's days. Thus shall it be during the Son of Man's arrival. Yet what were Noah's days genuinely like? Genesis chapter 6 communicates to us transparently. During those days, divine sons descended and claimed human wives. Their descendants were enormous beings, the Nephilim, entities of tremendous strength and unnatural understanding. It was resulting from them, based on certain manuscripts, that the world became corrupt, and therefore arrived the deluge, a divine restart. Yet should Jesus himself have cautioned that the conclusion would resemble those days, then what does that signify for us presently? Contemporary interest in enormous beings transcends inquisitiveness. It constitutes an indication. Across centuries, narratives of enormous beings were rejected as mythology. Yet presently, aged skeletal remains are receiving rediscovery. Ancient manuscripts are receiving translation. Individuals are commencing posing hazardous questions. What motivation exists for numerous societies referencing a race of enormous beings who previously governed the earth? What motivation exists for these narratives being so consistent, and what motivation exists for their return presently? Certain individuals accept we're entering the concluding age, that the elevation in understanding, the genetic unlocking, and the ancient structure exploration are all fragments of the prophecy, that we're once more becoming resembling the individuals preceding the deluge, arrogant, connected to prohibited understanding, blending elements never intended for blending. And at the boundary of this elevating tide positions a shadow from the past, the Nephilim. Suppose they never genuinely disappeared? Suppose their lineages persisted, concealed, anticipating? Suppose the motivation for the deluge wasn't merely regarding wrongdoing, but regarding containment, a method to postpone their return. And suppose that postponement is presently concluding. The Revelation book references beasts emerging from the sea, of insects possessing human faces, of enormous beings restrained underneath the Euphrates River, receiving release. These aren't representations of typical combat. They're remnants, visions of a reality returning to its ancient condition, an era when mankind traversed beside entities not originating from this world, and it entirely commences again when the threshold unseals. The Church has persisted silent on these connections. Revelation receives instruction as a mystery, not a caution, yet the evidence exists there, as it existed during Noah's days. Not merely an era of brutality, but an era of enormous beings, of descended angels, of genetic corruption. That constitutes the authentic caution, and we're already commencing witnessing the indications within the emergence of aged skeletal remains, within the return of prohibited understanding, within the secrets no longer persisting interred. The enormous beings aren't merely part of the past. They may be part of the future, and when they return, it won't be discreetly. It will indicate the commencement of the conclusion, exactly resembling it accomplished previously during Noah's days. Throughout the globe, individuals are awakening, possessing dreams they cannot clarify, sensations they've never sensed previously, an attraction toward ancient understanding, toward emblems and languages they've never examined. Certain sense attracted to the celestial bodies, alternative ones to abandoned structures, as though something inside them recalls, as though their lineage contains a narrative predating their consciousness can comprehend. Could this transcend imagination? Could this be genetic recollection, a fragment from an ancient lineage commencing to awaken? Scientific knowledge communicates to us that our DNA possesses more than physical characteristics. It contains recollections, sequences, behaviors transferred down across generations. Certain researchers accept trauma and experience can be encoded within our genetic material. Should that be accurate, then what transpires when a lineage possesses more than merely human recollections? What transpires when that lineage is contacted by something more ancient, something from preceding the deluge, something Nephilim? The concept isn't as implausible as it resonates. Throughout recent years, scientists have located what they designate junk DNA, strands appearing to possess no function. They remain dormant, silent. Yet suppose they aren't useless? Suppose they're secured, anticipating the appropriate conditions to activate, anticipating the reality to reach a particular frequency, a particular era, a particular synchronization. And when that instant arrives, the recollections inside commence awakening. Ancient manuscripts reference concealed wisdom, understanding incapable of being acquired from manuscripts, exclusively recalled, transferred down through the lineage. The Book of Enoch declares the Watchers instructed their descendants secrets of the celestial bodies, the earth, and the human physical form. The Nephilim inherited that understanding, and should their lineage have survived, thus did the recollection confined within the cellular structures, anticipating there exist individuals presently experiencing spontaneous understanding. They abruptly comprehend emblems they've never witnessed previously. They articulate in languages they've never examined. They illustrate celestial cartographic representations from recollection. They sense a connection to locations they've never visited. Scientists categorize it anomaly, yet alternative ones perceive it as an indication that the Nephilim lineage is awakening. Certain individuals accept that occurrences globally are stimulating this awakening. Modifications in magnetic forces, transitions in cosmic energy, ancient burial chambers receiving unsealing, prohibited manuscripts receiving interpretation again. All these may be unlocking something concealed within our fundamental structure, and those possessing Nephilim lineage may sense it initially. It's claimed that the Nephilim weren't merely enormous beings physically but mentally, that they possessed presence of perception, communication, restoration, and governance over nature. Should any of that persist, even in remnant quantities, then awakening that DNA could signify the return of capabilities we conceptualized were mythology, not sorcery, recollection. The Church possesses no authorized position on genetic recollection, yet their silence communicates volumes because, should it be genuine, then everything transforms. The past isn't merely behind us, it exists inside us, and those possessing ancient lineage may shortly recall who they genuinely are, not through dreams, but through awakening, through lineage summoning to lineage, through the remnant of enormous beings emerging once more, not from the ground, but from within. Within the initial chapters of Genesis, there exists an individual who disappears from Chronicles without caution. His designation is Enoch. He traverses with God, we're communicated, and subsequently he's eliminated, removed, not interred, not mourned, merely removed, as though his physical form was never intended to persist here. as though what he understood rendered him excessively hazardous to persist among mankind. Across centuries, this instant has puzzled interpreters. What motivation would God possess for removing an individual instead of permitting him to expire? What mystery did Enoch possess that nobody else could be entrusted with? To comprehend Enoch's disappearance, we must examine beyond Genesis. Within the Book of Enoch, the reality commences developing. Enoch isn't merely a devout individual. He's a recorder, an observer, a messenger between paradise and earth. He's selected to document the Watcher's actions, the angels descending and violating the divine regulations. He witnesses what they instruct. He witnesses what they generate. And he witnesses what becomes of their descendants, the Nephilim. Enoch doesn't merely monitor. He records, and that renders him an endangerment. Enoch documents prohibited understanding, mysteries of the celestial bodies, lunar movements, angelic identifications, and celestial authorities. He's displayed how time operates, how the earth is configured, how judgment will arrive. In summary, he witnesses the complete picture. He understands the commencement and the conclusion. And perhaps most significantly, he witnesses what's approaching following the deluge. The lineages surviving, the understanding receiving concealment, and the cycle repeating. When Enoch is removed, it isn't compassion's action, it's an extraction. He's extracted from the chronology because what he possesses cannot receive permission to descend into inappropriate hands. His scrolls, his visions, his comprehension of the Watchers and their technology would reshape the future if disclosed excessively soon. Therefore he's eliminated, elevated, concealed. Certain ancient manuscripts claim Enoch was transformed into the angel Metatron, an entity of tremendous authority presently positioning at God's throne as a recorder of all existence. Should this be accurate, it signifies Enoch was never intended to merely exist and expire. He formed part of a design considerably exceeding human existence, a connection between realms, a protector of understanding. There exists another theory that Enoch was removed not merely to maintain understanding, but to survive a judgment. The deluge was approaching. The earth was preparing to be purified, and Enoch, unlike Noah, couldn't form part of the survival below. He required removal preceding the restart, positioned beyond reach within a domain where recollection couldn't be eliminated. The Church seldom references Enoch's disappearance. His manuscript faced prohibition, his designation abandoned in sermons. Yet the mystery persists. An individual who didn't expire, an individual understanding excessively, and perhaps eventually, an individual returning, possessing the scrolls, possessing the reality, possessing the prohibited narrative of the enormous beings and the Watchers, not as legend, but as an observer to the initial age and a caution for the final one. For an establishment that has communicated with authority on nearly every subject underneath the celestial sphere, the Vatican's silence regarding enormous beings is overwhelming. No authorized position, no comprehensive commentary on Genesis chapter 6, no reference of the Nephilim within Catechism. And regarding the Book of Enoch, one among the most referenced manuscripts among initial Christians, the Church merely overlooks it, archives it, prohibits it, pretends it never existed. Yet that silence isn't coincidental. It's deliberate. And perhaps it constitutes the most pronounced verification of all. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 isn't merely a phrase within an extended narrative. It constitutes a fracture, a crack within the account. It references divine sons, mortal daughters, and enormous beings traversing the earth. It positions awkwardly between creation and the deluge, as though inserted by a recorder understanding it was excessively significant to exclude. Yet from elevated platforms to educational institutions, that verse receives superficial examination, sanitized with metaphors, rejected as mythology. The question is why? What motivation for not clarifying it? What motivation for not confronting it? The response may reside in what that verse implies. Should the Nephilim have been genuine, then thus were the divine sons descending. That signifies angelic entities interfered with mankind, that ancient societies weren't merely erected by human hands, that the reality preceding the deluge was a location of hybrid lineages, prohibited technology, and celestial uprising. That version of Chronicles doesn't conform to the purified, straightforward chronology the Church has dedicated centuries defending. The Book of Enoch renders it more severe. It identifies the angels, portrays their transgressions, details the mysteries they granted mankind. It discusses the enormous beings, the deluge, the punishment, and it positions Enoch at the center of everything. Removed by God, not stemming from belief exclusively, but resulting from witnessing excessively. This manuscript was previously cherished by initial Christians, referenced within the New Testament, maintained in Ethiopia. Yet, it faced exclusion from the canon, not stemming from falsehood, but resulting from disclosing excessively. And continuing, the Vatican communicates nothing. No retraction, no discussion, merely silence. Even when ancient skeletal remains are located not corresponding with human dimensions. Even when tribal narratives from across the globe resonate the Genesis accounts. Even when contemporary scientific knowledge commences investigating the concept of hybrid DNA and genetic recollection, the Church persists silent, observing, anticipating, communicating nothing. Certain individuals accept the silence constitutes a governance form. That referencing enormous beings would unseal excessive thresholds, direct toward excessive questions. Alternative ones conceptualize its dread, that the Church understands the reality and is frightened of what it signifies, that the Nephilim lineages never concluded, that certain continue traversing the earth, that ancient understanding is resurfacing, and that prophecy isn't regarding the past, but regarding what's approaching next. Ultimately, silence communicates volumes. It generates a space for suspicion, for uncertainty, for inquisitiveness, and perhaps that's why individuals are commencing listening again, not to the declarations the Church communicates, but to the ones it refuses communicating. The most pronounced reality is frequently the one nobody ventures to articulate. And within that silence, the Nephilim narrative continues expanding, anticipating discovery, anticipating acknowledgement. Every ancient society possesses a narrative, a caution, a tale murmured across generations regarding an era when enormous beings traversed the earth, when deities rebelled, and when a deluge consumed the world. These narratives originate from communities never convening, from continents separated by oceans and communication. Yet the specifics are so alike it's as though they were all recalling the identical occurrence, the identical reality. A recollection excessively enormous and excessively frightening to expire. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh communicates of a champion, partially divine, partially human, seeking immortality. His expedition discloses a worldwide deluge dispatched by the deities to eliminate a corrupt reality. An individual designated Utnapishtim erects a great vessel, survives the deluge, and maintains existence. Resemble familiar? It reflects Noah's narrative nearly precisely, yet it was composed hundreds of years previously. In India, Manu's narrative pursues a similar pathway, a catastrophic deluge, a selected individual, a floating vessel. The deities meddle, yet the reality requires purification. Throughout the ocean, the Mayans reference previous realities annihilated by water and flames. The Aztecs accepted previous suns or ages, each concluding in destruction resulting from divine uprising or human corruption. In Africa, narratives communicate of great entities descending from above and instructing mankind elements they shouldn't understand. In the Pacific Islands, legends reference tall, white-complexioned, enormous beings previously governing the territory and subsequently eliminated by a catastrophic deluge from the heavens. Native American communities recall red-haired enormous beings waging conflict with their forebears. Certain supposedly were cannibals, Alternative ones resided in caverns. Certain instructed peculiar understanding. All were eliminated in a catastrophic purification. And within the Norse tradition, there existed the Jotun, ancient enormous beings secured in struggle with the deities. Their conflicts generated storms, earthquakes, and ultimately Ragnarok, the day's conclusion. These narratives aren't separated by coincidence. They're remnants, recollection confined within mythology. Societies may configure specifics to conform to their acceptances, yet the sequence persists identical. A celestial uprising, the blending of divine and human, the emergence of enormous beings, a deluge, a restart, a caution. Even the celestial bodies contain the identical indications. Ancient zodiac configurations synchronize with deluge accounts. Celestial cartographic representations from Babylon to China reference watchers, protectors, and entities descending from the heavens. How could numerous societies throughout space and time distribute the identical structure of mythology unless it transcended mythology? Unless it represented recollection? The Church may categorize it allegory. Chroniclers may categorize it coincidence. Yet when the narratives repeat with such transparency, such burden, they commence articulating more powerfully than documented evidence. They indicate a distributed trauma, a worldwide occurrence, a mystery transferred down through emblems, narratives, and silence. What we categorize mythology may constitute human recollection's survival. What we categorize legend may constitute the final fragments of prohibited reality. And when they're all positioned adjacently, they no longer resemble fantasy, they resemble chronicles. One receiving burial, elimination, yet never abandonment, because the earth recalls, and thus do we. Suppose they never departed. Suppose the enormous beings of antiquity, the Nephilim, born of descended angels and human lineage, didn't disappear in the deluge as we received instruction. Suppose the narrative of their elimination was exclusively partial truth. Suppose certain survived, concealed, transformed, blending into human lineage so meticulously that their appearance became legend, subsequently mythology, subsequently abandoned altogether. Yet abandoned doesn't signify eliminated. Surrounding us exist remnants, emblems engraved into ancient stone, oversized positions of power and abandoned chambers, cathedrals possessing doorways elevated sufficiently to accommodate entities triple mankind's elevation, craniums possessing double tooth rows secured away in particle-covered exhibition hall underground levels, royal lineages fixated with purity, secret organizations protecting ceremonies they assert originate from the celestial bodies, murmurs within sacred manuscripts and prohibited scrolls. What are they attempting concealment? Or perhaps whom? Certain individuals claim the Nephilim acquired adaptation, that they dispersed following the deluge, proceeded underground, and resurfaced in forms we'd never suspect. Not perpetually as enormous beings in stature, yet in impact, in intellect, in charisma, that across time their descendants abandoned what they were, or selected abandonment. Yet profoundly within the skeletal structure, something ancient continues resonating, anticipating, observing. Could the elite possess their lineage? Could governors, popes, scientists, and cultural representatives be descended from the identical bloodline, previously disturbing the earth, preceding the rainfall? Could their dreams be troubled by a reality they never witnessed, yet somehow recall? The recollection of stone settlements demolished by water, the celestial sphere darkening, the watchers descending, their fathers' voices summoning from beyond the celestial bodies. And regarding the Vatican, what motivation for gathering manuscripts referencing enormous beings? What motivation for protecting chambers saturated with skeletal remains? What motivation for financing observatories in mountains and designating their optical instruments following the Lightbringer? Perhaps they understand. Perhaps they've perpetually understood. Perhaps their silence isn't rejection, it's dread or compliance. Throughout every generation there exist narratives. Youngsters born possessing peculiar presence. Individuals articulating languages they never examined. Visions sensing more resembling recollections. A connection to the celestial bodies scientific knowledge cannot clarify. These receive rejection as fantasy. Coincidence? Yet suppose they constitute the commencement of something, an awakening. The Revelation book references an era when the earth will disturb and ancient elements will emerge. It cautions of beasts and monarchs and false prophets. Yet suppose the beasts aren't creatures? Suppose their lineages traversing discreetly through the reality, concealing behind designations and positions and expressions, anticipating the appropriate instant to recall who they are. Not everything interred persists interred. Not every mythology is fictional. Occasionally reality wears a disguise so aged we abandon its ever-possessed features. Yet presently the fragments are receiving discovery. The sequences are returning. And the question persists. Suppose the Nephilim aren't eliminated? Suppose they continue here, observing us, examining us, preparing? And suppose eventually, shortly, they cease anticipating?